Good evening, friends. In tonight's story, we will discuss the lives of royal servants across different empires in the world. Servants are a force quiet, invisible, and barely talked about, but were a significant driving force of the mighty kings and queens. Their names are rarely written, their voices almost never heard. Yet, they were always there, lighting the torches, folding the robes, sweeping the steps of history. This is their story. Before we begin, support my work by liking the video and subscribing if you enjoy it. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always makes me smile to see people from all over the world tuning in. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and relax. You're just about to drift off with a story. First, we look at what it meant to serve within the silent corridors of ancient Egypt. In the royal palace of Thebes, even the stone walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with the sun. Massive, papyrus-shaped columns loomed like trees in the desert, casting striped shadows across polished limestone floors. The air held the warm, fragrant scent of myrrh and crushed lotus, the quiet perfume of wealth and power. Here, servants moved with quiet discipline. Their presence was expected but not acknowledged. They awoke before the horizon blushed with light, and their duties began in the soft dark of dawn. No voice was raised, no step echoed. In a hallway beneath carved lintels, a young boy balanced two ceramic jugs filled with watered wine. His feet were bare, and the coolness of the stone beneath him was a small mercy. He moved past walls that told the stories of gods, Ra above all, painted in ochres and gold leaf. He did not stop to look. His task was simple, to deliver the wine to the high steward's chambers before the second bell. In a quieter corner of the palace, where sunlight filtered in through narrow slits in the stone, a maidservant knelt beside a marble basin. She worked in silence, preparing scented oils for the noblewoman's morning bath. Her hands moved with practiced elegance, mixing almond oil with the petals of blue lotus. She placed them into alabaster jars, careful not to spill a drop. This was no mere chore. Every gesture reflected the status of the woman she served. The oil had to glisten but not overpower. The towels had to be warm but not hot. Elsewhere, the royal scribe was receiving his morning meal. A young servant knelt before him, eyes downcast, offering a tray of figs, flatbread, and dried perch, arranged not for taste but for order. Each item had its place. Even food was expected to obey symmetry. Beyond the chambers, in the open palace courtyard, barefoot laborers swept the floor with bundled palm branches. The courtyard was vast, lined with date palms and low shrines. Dust from the desert was always creeping in, and so the sweepers worked ceaselessly. Their arms moved in long arcs, back and forth, as officials in linen kilts passed by, their conversations trailing behind them like silken threads. For the sweepers were not addressed, they were not even seen. To serve in an Egyptian palace was to exist without question. Every movement, every breath was measured. Discipline was not just expected, it was survival. A dropped jug, a misfolded robe, a word spoken too loud, any of these could bring punishment. And yet, within that silence there was dignity, in the way a robe was folded with perfect corners, in how water was poured without a ripple, in the shine of a floor that caught the morning light just so. Their names were not carved into the temple walls. Their voices were not sung in ceremony, but their labor, constant, skilled, and invisible, held the palace together. Every mosaic tile, every polished basin, every waft of incense in the air carried the imprint of a servant's touch. And so the pharaoh walked on polished stone, never thinking of the barefoot boy who had scrubbed it clean. From the stillness of Thebes, we move westward across the Mediterranean to the city-states of ancient Greece, where sunlight danced on marble and servants moved like shadows through villas and courtyards. In Athens, the air was drier, brighter, courtyards open to the sky, framed by fluted columns and tiled roofs. Inside the homes of the wealthy, quiet labor unfolded behind every social gathering, every intellectual debate. Servants were the unseen rhythm beneath the Athenian way of life. In one villa near the Agora, the day began with the soft clatter of bronze dishes. A young boy was arranging olives and barley bread onto a polished tray. He moved with quick, precise motions, careful not to smear oil on the handles. The tray gleamed in the early light, its contents balanced perfectly before it was carried across the atrium to the breakfast table. Elsewhere in the house, the low murmurs of a symposium were just beginning. Gentle music drifted in through the painted doors, the soft strings of a lyre and the lazy hum of conversation. In the corner of the room, a servant girl stood silently behind a reclining nobleman. She held a woven fan made from reeds, her arms moving steadily to keep the warm summer air from settling on the guests. Her eyes remained lowered, but her ears caught every word. From philosophy to politics to private scandal. The kitchens behind the courtyard were warm and fragrant. A cook, assisted by 2 young servants, was preparing a midday meal. Roasted fish rubbed with crushed herbs, honeyed fruits, and wine chilled in clay amphorae. Clay ovens lined the back wall, their heat filling the room, while copper pots steamed gently above glowing embers. The cook gave orders with brief nods. The servants moved like dancers, each action efficient, learned through repetition rather than command. As the day warmed, life in the villa slowed. Servants tidied the floors with cloths soaked in lemon water. One girl carefully lifted a scroll from a reading stand, returned it to the library room, and brushed the dust from the stone shelves. In the garden portico, another boy wiped droplets of water from polished statues of Apollo and Athene, their faces gleaming in the golden sun. Later, as noblewomen gathered to speak behind a row of marble columns, their words softened into whispers. Behind the columns, half hidden in the filtered light, stood a quiet pair of attendants. Their faces revealed no expression, though they absorbed every fragment of conversation about marriage, reputation, inheritance. They were not meant to hear, but they always did. To be a servant in an Athenian household was to drift between knowledge and silence. Some were slaves from far-off lands, others born into bondage within the city. Yet all learned quickly, move without notice, listen without reacting, and perform every task as if it were sacred. They cleaned the marble before it hosted poetry. They laid the cushions before Plato or Pericles ever sat down. They washed wine-stained linen after the minds of Greece had argued and laughed. And when the guests departed, when the symposium fell to silence, they remained, sweeping the floors, refilling the lamps, resetting the world before morning returned. From the sun-drenched villas of Athens, we drift forward through time and across the sea to the heart of the Roman Empire, where marble met order and power wore sandals polished by the hands of the unseen. In Rome, palaces were not simply places of beauty, they were engines of discipline and hierarchy. Grand atriums opened to colonnaded courtyards, where fountains gurgled into shallow basins, and painted frescoes shimmered behind thin veils of mist. In these spaces, power was performed, not only by senators and patricians, but by the servants who prepared every corner in silence. To be a servant in a Roman household, particularly in the domus of the elite, was to live within strict boundaries. Many were slaves, captured through war or born into service. Yet within the world of Roman servitude, a hierarchy existed. At the top were educated scribes and house stewards. At the bottom, those who carried chamber pots and scrubbed latrines. One boy, perhaps no older than 14, crouched in the atrium at dawn. His task was laying mosaic tiles under the watchful gaze of a patrician architect. Each tile was a colored chip of stone, red porphyry, green serpentine, yellow limestone, arranged into elaborate patterns. It was cold work, kneeling on the hard floor, fingers numbed from morning chill, but the design had to be perfect. A mistake could bring scolding or worse, dismissal, or the whip. Further down the corridor, the palatial dining room, the triclinium, began to stir. Torches were lit with slow ceremony. Curtains were pulled back from arched doorways to let in the pale light. On a wide marble table, gold dishes were laid with exact spacing. A servant in a red tunic, belt tightly knotted, stood ready to pour wine. He knew the sequence by heart. Aged Falernian for the host, a lighter vintage for the guests. Watered down, for the lesser ranks. When the senator arrived, the servant stepped forward, bowed his head, and poured with slow confidence the amphora, steady despite its weight. In the bathhouse attached to the estate, another servant was folding linen towels with the scent of pressed lavender. Steam rose in plumes from the caldarium, warming the painted walls. Here the nobles would bathe and speak of law, alliances, or poetry. The servant, often unseen, ensured the marble was dry beneath their feet, the oil warmed to the right temperature, the towels uncreased. His hands bore the burns of boiling water, his wrists the ache of endless fold. And near the entrance of the home, another young slave brushed the dust from a Roman general's sandals. He worked in the marble atrium, where bronze statues of gods loomed above. Each buckle was polished, each leather strap checked. The general would not look at him, but the boy knew the ritual. Brush, inspect, straighten, retreat. Yet even amid the harshness, there were quiet moments. In the kitchens, servants whispered as they peeled garlic or kneaded dough. They shared crumbs of bread, fleeting jokes, and stories from their homelands, Carthage, Gaul, Judea, Thrace. They spoke of home in languages long forgotten by their masters. Roman palaces demanded order, from the architecture to the attitudes of those within. Even in art, symmetry ruled. Everything had its place, and so did every servant. Their lives were measured by performance, how well they anticipated a need, how quietly they moved, how invisible they became. They were not expected to think, only to act. Yet over time, some gained favor, trusted as body servants, allowed to handle documents, even tutored in letters. A rare few, upon manumission, became freedmen and continued to serve their former masters as clients, a legal category unique to Rome's social fabric. But for most, there was no rising. Only more sandals to clean, more jugs to pour, more floors to scrub until the marble shone brighter than the sun. And as Rome's mighty generals plotted conquests over maps and goblets of wine, they did so standing on polished stone, warmed by the hands of those who would never see a battlefield, the ones who lit the fires, fetched the armor, and carried the sweat-stained cloths back into the shadows. As the Roman Empire faded into dust, another world emerged across deserts and river valleys, the golden age of the Islamic caliphates. In the marble halls of Damascus, Baghdad, and Cordoba, the palaces of Umayyad and Abbasid rulers stood as masterpieces of symmetry, reflection, and light. And within their walls, servants moved like the steady flow of water, calm, essential, rarely seen. The architecture itself seemed to whisper. Long colonnades led to shaded courtyards, their floors paved with colored tiles and bordered with jasmine vines. Domes arched above with celestial geometry, every inch carefully balanced. And beneath this precision, barefoot servants followed routines crafted not only by tradition, but by theology. In the early morning, before the court awoke, a servant lit the incense in the caliph's throne room. The space was silent but alive. Walls painted in faded cobalt, carved wood screens filtering the rising sun. With careful hands, the servant set a small brass censer in the center of the room and lit the resin. The sweet smoke curled upward, catching the light in swirling columns. He bowed his head and stepped back, letting scent and space do their quiet work. Elsewhere in the palace complex, a eunuch walked softly through the royal library, his duty to organize scrolls, parchments, and early-bound volumes, knowledge gathered from Persia, Greece, India. Oil lamps flickered between rows of bookshelves, illuminating intricate Arabic script. His fingers brushed each title with reverence. He had no right to speak of what he read. Yet he understood every word. Many eunuchs were chosen not only for obedience but for their intellect, trusted to maintain order in the caliph's knowledge chambers. In the kitchens, the air was thick with spice. A boy stirred a clay pot of stewed lamb with dates and coriander. Large brass platters sat waiting to be filled. He worked beside men twice his age, their eyes focused on the rhythm of the task. No need for commands. Around him were sacks of saffron, baskets of figs, and iron tools blackened by use. Meals were a statement of wealth, but also of refinement. Every dish carried meaning. Servants did not eat until hours after the guests often, just the scraps, but they knew the scent and shape of every course. As the day moved on, a maid swept the palace floor. Each stone tile was a mosaic of color, red, green, black, cream, arranged into stars, vines, or sacred script. Her broom was made of dried reeds tied with rope. She moved slowly, methodically, not missing a corner. The palace floors were sacred ground. Dust was not just disorder, it was disrespect. Silence in these halls was not emptiness, it was etiquette. Servants rarely spoke unless addressed. They bowed low, stepped sideways when a noble passed, and waited hours to refill a goblet if it meant they wouldn't interrupt a poet's thought. Everything was about balance, like the architecture itself. And yet, within the strict formality, there was life. In the servant quarters, tucked behind the northern wing, laughter sometimes bubbled up, jokes in Persian, Arabic, Berber, Kurdish. Quiet songs hummed while hands washed garments in perfumed water. The palace may have been designed for discipline, but even here, humanity found its breath. The structure of service was woven into Islamic law and culture. Kindness to servants was praised in texts, yet hierarchy was never questioned. Eunuchs held keys to rooms nobles could not enter. Wet nurses raised royal children, yet remained forever apart. Power in these palaces was like a shadow, shifting, sometimes visible, never held by those who cleaned its edges. In Baghdad, where philosophers once debated beneath hanging lamps, servants memorized their steps like poetry. They prepared ink pots for calligraphers, cleared cushions after scholars left, and carried plates through gardens perfumed with orange blossom. And long after the poets slept, after the viziers left their scrolls rolled neatly on marble benches, the servants remained. Folding, brushing, refilling, the rhythm of devotion not to power, but to the spaces that held it. From the fragrant tiled halls of Baghdad, we cross into colder lands. Windswept hills, thick forests, and high stone walls. In medieval Europe, the palace was no longer a place of delicate symmetry. It was a fortress, a place of duty, fear, and layered silence. The great castles of France, England, and the Germanic kingdoms were built for survival first. Their beauty came later. Narrow windows, thick walls, wooden beams dark with smoke. In these shadowed corridors, the servants of queens and lords moved with caution. The air was heavy with the scent of burning tallow, wet stone, and boiled meat. Winter seemed to live in the walls. A young page boy crouched in the armor room at daybreak. He was polishing a knight's breastplate, his wool sleeves blackened from soot and wax. The armor was cold, heavy, and pocked with scratches. He rubbed it with beeswax and cloth until the light from a narrow arrow slit danced across its surface. His fingers ached, but the task was never questioned. The armor had to gleam, not for beauty, for honor. Up a twisting stone staircase, another servant moved through the queen's chambers. She carried fresh linens over her shoulder and paused to fold them neatly on the edge of a massive wooden bed. Tapestries lined the walls, some faded, some rich with reds and golds. The fire had long gone out. Her breath misted as she worked. On the oak table nearby, a silver comb and hand mirror rested beside a bowl of lavender water. She placed a fresh towel beside them, smoothing it flat without a sound. In the castle kitchens, fires roared in wide hearths. The cook shouted over the din, directing servants who moved between hanging herbs, iron pots, and carved boar meat. A servant carried a tray piled high with roasted boar, apples stuffed with cloves, and trenchers of thick bread. His arms were tired, but the tray could not tilt. A misstep in the banquet hall could mean embarrassment or punishment. Inside the great hall, nobles sat on long benches, eating, drinking, laughing. The noise echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings, and the stone floor scattered with rushes and rosemary. At the edge of the hall, a servant stood quietly with a jug of wine, waiting for the moment to refill goblets. His hands were still, his eyes never lingering too long. Behind him, maids circled with trays, dodging dogs and children and scowling stewards. In another tower, a laundry maid strained to carry a wooden basket up a spiral staircase. The weight pulled at her shoulders and the steps were slick with morning frost. At the landing, a steward scolded her for being too slow. She nodded, said nothing, and carried on. Despite the cruelty of some lords and the endless labor, there were rules, codes of hierarchy and service that shaped daily life. Page boys learned etiquette as well as sword care. Maids knew the rituals of court dressing, from how to lace a bodice to when to step back behind the curtain. There was a rhythm to the castle that never truly stopped, even in the dead of night. Sometimes, a moment of warmth flickered through, a wink from a stable hand, a stolen bite of warm bread, a candle lit early in the servants' hall so they could see each other's faces while they ate. For many, service was the only life they had ever known. Their parents served and their children would serve. They were rarely named in records unless they misstepped, and yet it was their hands that turned the gears of royal life. Without them, the armor rusted, the bread burned, and the crown went crooked. Long after the feasts ended and the nobles climbed to their heavy canopied beds, the servants remained, clearing the trenchers, washing the goblets, sweeping ash from the hearth, always working, always silent, always there. As the bells of European churches rang across misty hills, a quieter rhythm pulsed on the other side of the world. In the imperial and noble households of feudal Japan, service was not only a duty, it was an art form. A delicate, disciplined craft woven into the fabric of social harmony. Palaces in Kyoto and noble estates across the provinces were built with reverence for balance and nature. Wooden floors creaked gently beneath soft sandals. Paper screens glowed with filtered light. Cherry blossoms brushed against open windows in spring, and cicadas hummed against the silence of summer afternoons. A young servant girl rose before the sun, slipping quietly through sliding doors. Her first task was preparing the tea for her lady, a ritual that required calm hands and careful timing. The tray was laid with lacquered bowls, a ceramic teapot, and folded cloth. As she stepped into the chamber, the room was still, its walls painted with cranes and flowering branches. She bowed low, never meeting the noblewoman's eyes, and set the tray beside her with practiced care. In another wing of the estate, a palace worker carried scrolls down a long wooden corridor. His steps were steady, his hands clean. The floor had been swept just before dawn, and his reflection shimmered faintly in the polished wood. Outside, a breeze stirred the cherry trees, scattering petals like whispers. He paused briefly to adjust a scroll that had slipped, then continued, his face composed and unreadable. Within the royal kitchens, steam filled the air. A cook stirred rice in a cast-iron pot, while another servant sliced fish with a blade so sharp it sang. The scent of miso and charcoal floated between bamboo walls. The servants moved in silence, their motions honed over years. No wasted energy, no sudden noise. Meals here were not just nourishment, they were offerings of beauty. In a small, window-lit chamber, a hairdresser worked with quiet focus. Her fingers moved through the princess's long, black hair, shaping it for a ceremony. Each pin was placed with intention, each strand combed smooth. Behind her, other attendants stood ready with cosmetics made from crushed pearls and flower pastes. No instructions were spoken. They had done this many times before, and each time was sacred. Hierarchy within Japanese palaces was strict but subtle. Servants rarely spoke unless addressed, and their body language conveyed as much as their words ever could. Training was extensive. Girls were taught how to bow with precision, how to hold a tray at the right angle, how to leave a room without being noticed. Boys were trained to manage documents, fetch robes, prepare ink, and announce guests with the proper formality. Yet within the silence there was pride. Serving in a daimyo's house or the emperor's palace meant being part of something larger than oneself, something orderly, graceful, and enduring. These were homes shaped by centuries of tradition, and every servant knew their role in preserving that stillness. During festivals, the servants decorated corridors with paper lanterns and arranged flowers in shallow ceramic bowls. During winter, they lined sliding doors with cloth to keep out the cold. They washed rice in cold streams, cleaned inkstones with soft cloths, and swept fallen leaves from stone paths. And in their own quarters, tucked behind garden walls, they shared warm meals and quiet laughter. They repaired torn sleeves by candlelight and whispered poems under their breath while folding blankets for the next day's dawn. When the nobleman left for war, it was the servants who packed his armor. When the mistress wept behind her fan, it was the maid who gently placed a fresh cloth beside her and left without a word. They left no signature behind. But their hands shaped everything, from the hairpins in the princess's crown to the rice bowl on the emperor's tray. The palace breathed through them. From the still, contemplative corridors of Kyoto, we journey now to the golden halls of Mughal India, where marble gleamed like moonlight, and servants walked barefoot across mosaics bright with turquoise, jade, and lapis lazuli. In cities like Agra, Lahore, and Delhi, the palaces of emperors rose like dreams from the earth. Domes curved into the sky. Water channels flowed through courtyards lined with fruit trees and flowering shrubs. The scent of sandalwood mingled with rose water, drifting gently through carved screens and open pavilions. Within these walls, servants were the invisible weavers of royal comfort. Their tasks ranged from the earthy to the exquisite, from scrubbing copper trays to preparing silks for an emperor's robe. In a sun-warmed kitchen tucked beneath the central courtyard, a servant crouched beside a clay stove. He was grinding spices on a flat stone with rhythmic pressure. Cinnamon, clove, black pepper, and dried chilies, reduced to a fragrant powder. Brass trays glinted nearby, waiting to be filled. Another boy stirred a pot of saffron rice with almonds, his arm moving steadily. The kitchen buzzed without chaos. Every task known by heart, every pot exactly where it should be. Upstairs, in a hall lit by carved jolly windows, a eunuch stood fanning the emperor. The throne room was an ocean of cool white marble, accented by gold inlay and jeweled ornaments. The eunuch's fan was made from peacock feathers, and he moved it gently, rhythmically. He never spoke unless asked, never sat in the emperor's presence. Yet he stood closer than generals. Elsewhere in the palace, a laundrywoman hung dyed silks across bamboo poles stretched between minarets. The fabrics rippled in the warm breeze, blues, oranges, greens, drying under the afternoon sun. Below her, palace maids swept the courtyard tiles with broad brushes of date palm fiber, their hands red from rosewater soap. A few paces away, the palace tutor was surrounded by young noble children, guiding them through Persian poetry and arithmetic. Behind him, a quiet servant fetched a copper jug of water, placing it near the children without a sound. Even in learning, servants moved beside the elite, their labor shaping the environment of knowledge. Service in the Mughal court came with layers of complexity. Some servants were drawn from hereditary positions. Their fathers and mothers had served before them. Others were captured in war or tribute. Eunuchs, many of them from Central Asia or Africa, rose to high trust and influence within the harem and treasury. Water bearers, scribes, jewel keepers, wardrobe managers, each role was specialized, refined, passed down like a craft. The harem, a secluded world within the palace, was maintained entirely by women and eunuchs. Here, servants arranged perfume bottles, prepared clothing, combed hair, and lit lamps scented with oud and ambergris. The daily rhythm was one of devotion to detail, folding veils without a wrinkle, arranging sandals in a straight line, lighting candles just as the sun dipped behind the domes. Beyond duty, there were moments of secret rest. In the servants' quarters behind the kitchen garden, laughter sometimes floated in the air. The clink of tin bowls shared stories in Urdu, Bengali, Pashto. Children of the staff played near the water channels, mimicking the nobles they served with sticks for swords and flowers for crowns. Yet dignity was not always granted. A spilled tray, a wrinkled robe, a dish served cold, these could bring scorn. The Mughal court was refined, but not always forgiving. Servants learned to observe everything: the emperor's mood, the silence between commands, the flick of a hand that meant go or come closer. But within their silence was legacy. The silver polish on a sword handle, the jasmine petals strewn before a bride, the steam rising from a copper pot of korma, each told a story that no chronicler recorded. Their hands embroidered history, thread by invisible thread. And when the drums of court faded at night, when music dissolved into stillness, the servants moved like ghosts, extinguishing torches, straightening cushions, ensuring that when the sun rose again, the illusion of effortless splendor would return. From the opulent courts of Mughal India, our path winds northeast into the walled palaces of Qing Dynasty China, where the emperors of the Middle Kingdom ruled beneath golden rooftops, and every footstep within the Forbidden City echoed centuries of ritual. The Forbidden City itself was a masterpiece of symmetry and symbolism. Red walls guarded inner courtyards where only the chosen could tread. Golden tiles shimmered in the morning sun. Stone lions flanked entryways, and vermilion columns rose like forest trunks toward the carved ceilings. It was a world within a world, guarded, ordered, and immense. Here the servant was not merely a helper. He was part of the imperial rhythm. One misstep in a ritual, one error in a scroll, one moment of interruption, and the illusion of divine order would crumble. So they moved with care, not just because they were commanded, but because the very heart of the empire seemed to beat through their footsteps. In one vast hall, an elderly servant presented scrolls to an imperial official seated beneath a carved dragon canopy. His robe was simple, pale blue with a black trim, and his fingers trembled slightly as he passed the precious documents. The air smelled faintly of ink, sandalwood, and the rice paper on which dynasties had been drawn. The official said nothing. The servant bowed deeply, retreating in silent respect. In the palace kitchen, another world stirred. Massive iron woks clanged over roaring flames. Dumplings were prepared in bamboo steamers, each folded with elegant precision, the same way for generations. Cooks moved in near silence, save for the hiss of oil and the splash of broth. One young kitchen boy, no older than 10, moved quickly between prep stations, fetching ginger, carrying bowls, refilling vinegar jars. His bare feet tapped softly on the stone floor. He had learned early on to speak only when spoken to. Further along the northern wing, a child servant dashed through a corridor, a porcelain tea set rattling gently in the lacquered tray he carried. Outside, plum blossoms bloomed in the courtyard, and the soft clink of bells from a passing wind chime echoed in the air. He didn't look out the window. He didn't dare. The tea was for a dowager empress, and it had to arrive while the water was still steaming. In a quieter corner, a maid swept the floors of a side chamber. The walls were decorated with painted silk scrolls, mountains, cranes, and mists. Beside her stood tall porcelain vases, hand-painted in soft blues and pale greens. Her broom was bound from dried reeds, and her strokes were gentle, so as not to disturb the dust of ages. The floor gleamed when she finished. She didn't smile. She bowed to the space, folded her cloth, and left without a sound. Within the Forbidden City, ranks of servants were immense and deeply hierarchical. There were palace maids, eunuchs, page boys, cooks, tailors, calligraphers, lantern bearers, fan holders, each with a title, a place, and a duty. Eunuchs, in particular, often rose to great influence, managing imperial seals, court schedules, and sometimes even politics behind the screen. And yet, none of these servants owned their lives. Their existence was dedicated to maintaining the order of the imperial world, a world where the emperor was the son of heaven and anything less than perfection was dishonor. Servants rehearsed rituals. They studied the language of bows. They memorized the ways to fold robes, light lanterns, trim candle wicks, even how to walk across certain floors, heel first, quietly, evenly. Despite this, their world had moments of still beauty. In the early dawn, when snow dusted the palace rooftops, a servant might pause to watch it melt slowly off the gold tiles. In the summer heat, they cooled cloths in ice buckets before pressing them to the neck of a sweating scholar. And when the emperor retired and the final gong echoed through the courtyards, they remained unseen, moving like wind between curtains. No monument bears their name. No poetry was written in their honor. But their labor made the forbidden city function like a divine clock, silent, intricate, precise. As we leave the rigid harmony of Qing palaces, we enter a more hidden realm, the humid, temple-rich heart of the Khmer Empire, where royal life unfolded beneath jungle canopies and among stone towers carved with smiling gods. At its peak in the 12th century, Angkor was among the largest cities in the world, a vast network of reservoirs, causeways, and royal compounds stretching across what is now Cambodia. At its center stood Angkor Wat, a temple place unlike any other, built not just as a home for kings, but as a celestial map, a bridge between heaven and earth. Here, in the pre-dawn stillness, the servants of the palace stirred. The air was thick with mist rising from the moats, carrying the scent of lotus blossoms and damp earth. Inside the stone courtyards, barefoot attendants moved like ghosts, their cloth robes clinging softly to their legs, their movements precise and reverent. Near the temple's main gallery, a servant lit oil lamps one by one. Each was placed at specific intervals along a carved corridor. The stone beneath his feet was cool, etched with bas reliefs that told the story of gods and battles. Vishnu's chariot, the churning of the ocean, dancers caught mid-step. The boy worked in near darkness, guided by memory and flame. Elsewhere, in a shaded palace chamber, a palace boy stood near the king's platform. It was early morning, the jungle sounds still low and half-muted, and the monarch had not yet stirred. The boy fanned him with a palm leaf fan, sweat running down his temples even in the morning cool. Behind him, carved wooden screens filtered the first rays of sun. The king slept deeply, wrapped in silk. The servant stood without shifting, watching a gecko crawl across the ceiling's beams. Outside, in the inner gardens, a maid knelt before bowls of herbs and flowers, lemongrass, jasmine, and crushed tamarind, preparing them for a ritual bath. The courtyard was alive with color, red hibiscus against the green moss, the yellow flash of a bird, the sheen of water over stone. Her hands moved with care, mixing blossoms and oils into clay bowls, while her bare feet pressed gently into the wet earth. In the outer corridor, a group of laborers scrubbed the mosaic floor with coconut husks soaked in rainwater. The patterns beneath their hands told stories, sacred geometry shaped by faith. One man hummed an old prayer song as he worked. They had done this every day for years. Yet the stones still gleamed anew each morning. Hierarchy in the Khmer court was intricate. There were royal attendants for every member of the household, including queens, priests, ministers, and dancers. Pages carried messages between stone towers. Eunuchs guarded the inner chambers. Priestly aides prepared altars and offerings. Many servants were drawn from rural families trained in silence and brought into palace life by inheritance or conscription. Their duties extended beyond function. They upheld ritual. Timing, posture, and even facial expression were often choreographed in service to cosmic balance. To spill water during a ceremony or misplace an incense bowl was to disrupt more than etiquette. It was to disturb the divine rhythm. And yet, in quiet corners of the palace compound, they lived lives of small joys. After sunset, when prayers were done and the royal family retired, servants would sit beneath tamarind trees, sharing rice and jackfruit from banana leaves. They combed each other's hair, traded stories from distant villages, and bathed in the moonlight-drenched ponds behind the kitchen walls. Their world was one of patience and rhythm, of sweeping, scrubbing, fanning, preparing, waiting. No one praised their precision, no monument listed their names. Yet without them, the flame would go out, the robe would be wrinkled, the altar would stand empty. And when the conch sounded for dawn prayers, it was the servants who had already prepared the offering trays, washed the sacred statue, lit the path. The god smiled from the stone, but it was human hands that kept the temple clean. From the mossy courtyards of Angkor, we now arrive in the tiled palaces of Joseon, Korea, where harmony was measured not in gold or marble, but in order, balance, and restraint. The royal palaces of Hansong, now Seoul, such as Gyeongbokgung and Changdeokgung, were not built to overwhelm, but to calm. Long wooden corridors framed peaceful courtyards, green-tiled roofs curled softly above pale walls. Everything felt balanced, a living poem in wood and stone. Here the palace servant was not simply a laborer, he or she was a cog in an elegant machine of Confucian design. Every action, from pouring tea to announcing a royal visitor, was part of a ritualized dance governed by centuries of etiquette. It was not enough to do a task well, it had to be done correctly. In the early morning, before the court stirred, a servant stepped quietly into a silk-draped closet. Her task, arranging the queen's garments. Folded jeogori, jackets, voluminous chima, skirts, belts, and embroidered underlayers, had to be perfectly aligned, organized by season, purpose, and symbolism. She moved with a slow precision, careful not to crease the delicate fabric dyed in hues of jade, crimson, and indigo. Behind her, sunlight filtered through a paper window, casting soft patterns on the lacquered floor. In the royal kitchen, steam hissed from iron pots as cooks prepared the morning meal: rice, fermented vegetables, grilled fish, and ginseng broth. One cook leaned over a stone grinder, turning soaked soybeans into paste. Another arranged brass bowls with sliced persimmons and chestnuts. A younger helper wiped the counter with soaked cloth, glancing nervously as a head cook adjusted a spice jar. Every movement was watched. Every detail mattered. Outside, a young helper bowed deeply before a nobleman in the courtyard. His hands shook slightly as he offered a message scroll, sealed with red wax. The nobleman accepted it with a nod. Around them, tall pines swayed in the cool morning wind, their branches whispering gently over tiled rooftops. Nearby, a maid was cleaning a paper screen near a lattice window. She dipped a soft cloth in warm water and moved in long, gentle strokes, careful not to tear the delicate hunji paper. The view beyond the window showed a garden path lined with white stones and flowering trees. Magnolia in spring, golden ginkgo in fall. Palace hierarchy was strict. At the top were the Nain, or female palace attendants, who served the queen and princesses. They trained for years, learning court language, embroidery, dress protocol, and how to read subtle cues in tone and gesture. Male servants were assigned to officials, archives, stables, and military storage, many drawn from commoner families or assigned by village quotas. Every servant was expected to master the art of invisibility. They moved only when summoned. They spoke only when asked. And yet their knowledge of court life was often greater than the nobles they served, for they observed everything, remembered everything, and moved constantly between the layers of royal existence. The Joseon court was driven by Confucian ideals of order and purity. Meals were eaten in silence, letters were sealed with care, even footsteps were measured. And yet life for a servant was not without moments of intimacy and warmth. Nain, who served the royal children, often grew emotionally close, becoming caretakers and storytellers. Servants who lit lamps late at night sometimes paused, watching the moonlight ripple across a pond as frogs sang from beneath the eaves. In their own quarters, servants ate together, mended their robes, and whispered news from the outside world. Some composed poems, others sketched the royal garden in charcoal before wiping it away. In this quiet world, behind the silk screens, a different kind of beauty unfolded, one that history books rarely recorded. And when the royal court assembled in full dress, when colors swirled and trumpets sounded, it was the servants who had prepared every thread, ironed every crease, and tied every ceremonial knot with fingers that remembered more than books ever could. They moved between roles, attendant, cleaner, guard, caretaker, without fanfare, but through their grace the court endured, it breathed. From the tranquil palaces of Joseon, Korea, we turn westward to the ancient city of Constantinople, heart of the Byzantine Empire. where palaces, basilicas, and throne rooms fused Roman authority with Christian sanctity. Here, the empire's spiritual and political heart pulsed beneath golden domes and marble walls. The great palace of Constantinople, overlooking the Sea of Marmara, was a vast and sprawling complex, a fusion of Roman colonnades, Greek courtyards, and Christian chapels. Gold leaf sparkled on ceilings, walls were covered in glowing mosaics, saints with solemn eyes, imperial eagles, vines entwined with sacred symbols. The scent of beeswax and frankincense lingered in every corner. Amid this grandeur, a silent force kept the palace alive, its servants trained in the twin arts of reverence and routine. In the early morning, as dawn filtered through clerestory windows, a palace attendant moved slowly through a marble hallway. His sandals clicked softly as he carried a polished censer toward the emperor's private chapel. Inside, sacred icons glinted in candlelight. Christ Pantocrator, the Virgin Theotokos, saints with raised fingers and gilded halos. The servant lit the incense with practiced hands. Smoke rose like prayer into the high dome. Elsewhere in the imperial bedchambers, a female attendant prepared the empress's mourning garments. Silks, imported from the east, dyed in Tyrian purple, embroidered with golden thread, were laid out beside sandals inlaid with pearls. The room was quiet. The only sound, the soft rustle of fabric. Mirrors reflected the flickering lamplight. The attendant smoothed a crease from a sleeve, then placed a jeweled pin beside the belt, precisely aligned. In the palace kitchens, fire crackled beneath large copper cauldrons. Cooks stirred thick stews of lentils and barley, sprinkled with saffron and vinegar. A young boy ran to fetch baskets of flatbread from a tiled oven, dodging past servants preparing platters of dates, cheese, and roasted fish. Meals were not merely nourishment, they were performance, served in courses with silver cutlery and Byzantine glass. Near the imperial archives, a eunuch servant carefully laid scrolls and illuminated codices along a cedar table. These were official histories, church documents, and political treaties, written in Greek, often adorned with delicate painted borders. He moved each one with reverence, aware that a misplaced seal could alter imperial memory. Servants in Constantinople served an emperor seen as God's chosen, the earthly representative of divine will. As such, court ritual was infused with sacred choreography. Attendants walked a prescribed number of steps. Pages announced guests with rehearsed phrases. Maids cleaned with rosemary water, believed to purify not only space but spirit. The proposit, high-ranking palace eunuchs, held immense influence. They oversaw ceremonies, finance, and protocol. Beneath them, lesser eunuchs managed specific wings: the wardrobe, the harem, the chapel, the library. Female attendants were assigned to imperial women, trained from a young age in discretion and devotion. Servants also maintained the Hagia Sophia, the empire's holiest church. Though separate from the palace, it was part of the empire's daily rhythm. Servants polished marble floors before liturgy, they trimmed candles, prepared relics, and laid robes for bishops. Even here, their names were never spoken aloud, yet their presence shaped every sacred act. Despite the hierarchy, there were moments of grace. During feast days, kitchen servants received extra portions. On Easter, embroidered sashes were gifted to loyal attendants. And in quiet corners, a bench beneath a fig tree, a window overlooking the sea, they found space to breathe, to whisper, to be. Life was not easy. A servant's error during mass or court ceremony could bring public reprimand. A shattered goblet, a wrinkled robe, an unlit candle, all could ripple through the palace like a broken prayer. But most servants learned to live like icons themselves, still, luminous and silent. They were trained to hold the moment, to understand when to appear and when to vanish. Their reward was not glory, but endurance. And when the city walls echoed with chants, when imperial processions moved through arched corridors, when the emperor stood beneath a golden mosaic raising his right hand in blessing, It was their unseen work that held the vision in place. From the candlelit mosaics of Byzantium, we now cross into the world of the Ottomans, heirs to Constantinople's grandeur and masters of a vast empire stretching from Eastern Europe to the Arabian deserts. At the heart of this empire stood Topkapi Palace, perched above the Bosphorus, a city within a city, humming with protocol, intrigue, and quiet labor. Unlike European palaces built for show, Topkapi was a complex of courtyards, gardens, and pavilions, woven together like a tapestry. The palace was serene and majestic, with domes capped in gold, calligraphy winding along walls, and gardens perfumed with roses and tulips. Here, the empire's power moved silently, and so did its servants. At dawn, long before the Sultan awoke, a boy in the palace kitchen stirred coals beneath a massive copper pot. Steam hissed as he poured in broth for breakfast, a simple dish of rice, lamb, and spices. Nearby, another servant sliced dates and dried apricots into silver bowls. The kitchens, among the largest in the world, employed hundreds of cooks, assistants, and fire tenders. Every dish had a purpose, every hand had its role. Inside the imperial harem, a world entirely of its own, a female attendant gently adjusted the veil of a concubine preparing to meet the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and one of the most powerful figures in the palace. The attendant straightened the hem of a silk robe, arranged the woman's jewelry, and checked the perfume burners placed near the window. Their movements were silent, their presence constant. Down a tiled corridor, a eunuch in a deep blue robe stood watch near the privy chamber, where the Sultan prayed and kept his personal belongings. His eyes never wandered. He had risen through years of discipline, from a silent page to guardian of the inner sanctum. He carried the weight of protocol, honor, and sometimes secrets too dangerous to be written. Elsewhere, in the Enderum school, young boys from across the empire, many taken through the Debsirmi system, were being trained for service. One boy sat cross-legged on a carpet, memorizing verses of the Quran, while another practiced calligraphy under the watchful eye of a tutor. They would grow to be scribes, architects, treasurers, or military commanders, but first they learned to serve, with silent obedience and unshakable attention to detail. Ottoman palace service was deeply hierarchical. There were servants for every possible domain: food, clothing, water, horses, paper, silver, books, incense, and the royal baths. Eunuchs managed the harem in private apartments, chief stewards oversaw feasts, gardeners tended the sacred tulips, while scribes copied the Sultan's decrees by hand. Even the smallest detail had sacred weight. The Sultan's turbans were wrapped daily by attendants trained in geometry. His robes, stored in cedar-lined rooms, were aired by servants twice a week. His bath was drawn to exact temperatures and filled with rose petals and perfumed oils, prepared by a team that knew never to speak above a whisper. On festival days, the palace swelled with activity. Servants hung embroidered banners, musicians rehearsed their chords, bakers shaped sweets into crescents and domes, and when the Sultan passed through the gate of felicity, every servant dropped to their knees in silence, not just for respect, but to become part of the scenery, unseen but present. There were harsh realities, too. A servant who spilled ink on an imperial document could be exiled. A kitchen boy who broke a porcelain dish from China might be whipped. Palace intrigue often swept up even the lowest staff, caught in jealous whispers or misplaced loyalties. Yet among the tiled fountains and shaded colonnades, life also held beauty. At night, under the moonlight, young pages would whisper stories in the servants' quarters. Old gardeners brewed tea with dried mint and honey. Eunuchs read poetry or copied manuscripts to pass the hours. In these quiet spaces, the soul of the palace lived, away from politics and crowns. The Ottomans called their empire the Devleti Ali, the sublime state, and while the sultans held the scepter, it was the unseen hands of their servants that kept the sublime alive, polishing, folding, feeding, arranging, and protecting, all without fanfare. From the domed halls of Ottoman Istanbul, we now walk across marble floors worn smooth by sandals into the sun-drenched world of Rome, the eternal city, where columns scraped the sky and servants lived in the shadows of gods and senators. in the homes of the wealthy, be they senators, patricians, or provincial governors. Life was a meticulously choreographed performance, and every performance required a crew. Slaves and freedmen, not nobles, were the ones who made Roman life function. Rising before the sun, cleaning, cooking, carrying, organizing, and sometimes enduring cruelty in silence. Let us begin in the grand atrium of a Roman villa. Light spills from the central opening above, glinting off the marble floor and small pool, the impluvium, that collects rainwater below. A young slave, barely into his teens, kneels beside it, scrubbing with a cloth. His tunic is plain, his hair neatly shorn. He doesn't look up as his master passes by, not from fear, but because he was trained never to. In the triclinium, or dining room, another servant carefully arranges pillows around 3 couches. The evening banquet is soon, and the silver tableware must be perfectly placed. A more senior servant, likely a freedman who earned his status through years of loyalty, checks the wine jugs and instructs 2 younger slaves to fetch garum, the fermented fish sauce essential to Roman meals. They hurry, knowing a delay could mean punishment. Near the entrance, a doorkeeper, or eontor, stands quietly beside the villa's tall wooden doors. His job is more complex than it seems. He not only watches who enters and exits, but keeps a record of visitors and messages. He wears a simple chain around his neck, a sign of trust and servitude. Behind the scenes, in the kulyena, or kitchen, thick smoke hangs in the air. A cook stirs lentils and onions over a hearth while another tends to a clay oven filled with bread. The kitchen is hot, chaotic, and dimly lit, yet it runs with steady rhythm. The smell of pepper, vinegar, and honey fills the space, blending into something unmistakably Roman. Elsewhere in the house, a maidservant prepares a noblewoman's bath. She fetches water heated over coals and pours it slowly into a marble basin. The room is scented with oil of myrrh and rose petals. She lays out fresh towels woven from Egyptian linen, folds her mistress's stola, and lays combs, carved from bone, beside a bronze mirror. Roman households often functioned like miniature courts, and large ones could employ dozens, even hundreds of slaves. Some served as tutors, musicians, bodyguards, or scribes. The most trusted became stewards or vilici, managing entire estates or overseeing financial accounts. These slaves were often educated, multilingual, and more informed than many Roman citizens. And then there was the familia urbana, the urban household staff. These men and women lived in small quarters near or within the villa. Their lives were tightly controlled, their freedom non-existent. But some, through years of loyalty and skill, were manumitted, granted their freedom, and often continued serving as freedmen, now with limited rights but greater dignity. Life as a servant in Rome was not always cruel, but it was always precarious. A patrician's mood, a change in politics, or even a scandal could upend an entire staff. Some masters were generous, allowing their slaves to save money, learn trades, or purchase their freedom. Others were brutal, treating even loyal servants as expendable tools. Yet in between the extremes, most servants simply lived, surviving day to day in a world where they were always present but rarely noticed. At night, after the family had eaten and bathed, after the lamps had been extinguished and the mosaic floors swept, the servants retired to their quarters. There, away from marble and judgment, they whispered in Greek, Egyptian, or Punic. They shared jokes, wine, prayers, and sorrows. They rubbed tired feet, sewed tunics, and talked of distant villages they barely remembered. They were the unseen pillars of Rome, silent, tireless, and essential. Without their hands, the empire would have crumbled not from war or famine, but from untied sandals, unlit torches, and undelivered letters. From Rome's bustling villas, we now step into the cool courtyards of Athens, Corinth, and Delphi, cities where democracy stirred, tragedies unfolded on stage, and daily life turned on the quiet work of household servants, many of them enslaved or semi-free. In an Athenian oikos, the household, mornings began with stillness. The stone floors were cool beneath bare feet. A thin stream of smoke drifted from the cooking hearth. In one corner, a young Paidisk female servant gently fanned the coals, ready to prepare bread made from barley and olive oil. The air smelled of citrus leaves and warm clay. Outside in the andrin, or men's hall, a boy servant arranged a tray of olives, figs, and diluted wine. This room, reserved for male guests and symposia, had been swept thoroughly the evening before. Low couches were covered in patterned linen, and the black vigor pottery had been polished with olive oil to catch the lamplight. Unlike the vast palaces of other empires, Greek homes were modest in scale, centered around an inner courtyard. But within those walls, domestic life was complex and entirely reliant on the hands of servants. They drew water from clay jars, spun wool on vertical looms, helped children with sandals, folded chitons, and swept fallen petals from the stone threshold. Most of these servants were doulos, or doule, enslaved individuals captured in war, purchased from foreign markets, or born into servitude. Many were from Thrace, Asia Minor, Egypt, or Syria, and their lives were governed entirely by their master's household. In elite homes, a trusted male slave might serve as a pedagogue, a guardian and teacher for the children. He accompanied the young boy to school, held his tablet and stylus, and waited quietly during lessons. His role was both servant and tutor, and many aristocratic Athenians owed their early learning to such a figure. In the gynaeceum, or women's quarters, the hum of female labor filled the rooms. Here, servant women combed the mistress's hair, embroidered robes, prepared perfumes, and helped her with her jewelry. Their days moved in rhythm with the loom, a quiet song of industry, patience, and unspoken wisdom. During festivals or banquets, the pace quickened. Servants polished bronze mirrors, arranged garlands, lit oil lamps, and laid out platters of lamb, cheese, and honey cakes. At symposia, they poured wine in carefully measured dilutions, refilled kylix cups, and cleared away fruit rinds and crumbs with practiced grace. They were trained to appear only when needed and to vanish just as swiftly. Despite their invisibility, some servants became deeply entwined in the lives of their households. A nursemaid might raise a child from birth, a cook might know the family's recipes better than its matriarch, and though they lacked freedom, their influence shaped every detail of domestic life, from the flavor of the food to the comfort of the bedding. Servants also accompanied their masters to the agora, the public square. They carried baskets, guarded packages, and waited quietly at the fringes of conversation. During religious festivals, some prepared sacred offerings or led the family's procession in ritual dress, carrying incense or wreaths of laurel. Legally, an enslaved person in ancient Greece had no rights. They were property. But socially, their lives varied widely. Some were treated with care, even affection. Others suffered abuse or neglect. A few, through exceptional loyalty or skill, were manumitted, granted freedom, and often continued to live near or with the families they had once served. In the quiet hours of the night, when the lamps were extinguished and the house fell into silence, the servants slept in small quarters near the storage rooms or kitchen. There, among clay jars and woven mats, they whispered in foreign tongues, sang lullabies remembered from far-off homelands, and dreamed of mountains and rivers they'd never see again. Their names did not survive in epics. Their lives were not carved into marble. But without them, the philosophers would have eaten no bread, the poets no honeyed wine, and the temples no offerings. The grandeur of Greece rested not just on marble columns and theater masks, but on the backs of those who rose before dawn and laid down only after the last guest had departed. From the tiled courtyards of Greece, we now step into the echoing stone halls of medieval castles and manors. Across the vast patchwork of kingdoms that stretched from Normandy to Bohemia, from the hills of Scotland to the coasts of Italy. This was a time of feudal order, of towering keeps and narrow spiral stairs, where power was worn on armor and embroidered into tapestries. And yet, power was only possible because of the labor that supported it, the quiet, often brutal lives of the servants. Medieval noble household was like a small city. Inside its walls lived dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers, all with carefully defined roles. From page boys to kitchen maids, from grooms to chamberlains, everyone had a station, and few dared step beyond it. In the earliest morning hours, a scullery maid awoke in a chilly side room beside the castle kitchens. Her hands were raw from lye soap and winter frost. Before anyone else stirred, she was already fetching water from the well, starting fires beneath the heavy iron pots, and scrubbing the day's wooden trenchers for breakfast. The scent of smoke, turnips, and baked oats filled the air. In a small chamber nearby, a young page boy, usually the son of a minor noble, dressed his lord's boots. He folded the cloak, polished the belt buckle, and buckled the sword with shaking hands. His job was a privilege and a test, the first step toward knighthood. But for now, he was mostly ignored, running messages, delivering gloves, and helping the stable boys saddle horses. Inside the great hall, long before the lord and lady emerged, household stewards inspected arrangements. Candles were trimmed, rushes were freshly laid across the stone floor to absorb odors and soften footsteps. Servants laid out bread, cheese, and watered wine for the morning meal, their movements quiet beneath the high-beamed ceilings and carved hammer arches. In the ladies' solar, the warmer and more private living quarters of the noblewoman, maids readied spools of wool and bowls of lavender water. One folded linen undergarments, while another arranged the lady's headdress and combed her hair with boar bristle brushes. Behind them, the embroidered tapestry on the wall, a hunt, a courtship, a tale of knights, seemed to come to life in the morning light. Life for servants in the medieval world was defined by service and silence. They rose before the sun, retired long after the last candle burned low, and were present at every moment, yet almost never heard. Some were free peasants seeking shelter and work, others were serfs, bound to the lord's estate by law, a few were indentured or traded for debts. In wealthier households, trained stewards and butlers were essential, literate, loyal, and knowledgeable in both finances and diplomacy. In the kitchens, life was hot and hectic. Boiling cauldrons, spitted venison turning over fire, flatbread baking in stone ovens. Servants moved between stores of salt pork, barrels of ale, and baskets of herbs. Mistakes could be costly. Too much spice, too little meat, or a cracked goblet before a feast might mean punishment or dismissal. In the servants' quarters, cramped and unheated, they rested on hay-stuffed pallets. There was little privacy, but shared warmth and whispered songs. Old tales passed between generations of servants, of lost loves, forest spirits, and distant battles. The castle's silence was broken not by the nobles, but by the muffled laughter of those who served them. Hierarchy among servants was strictly enforced. A chamberlain or seneschal oversaw the entire household. Beneath them were valets, cooks, laundresses, falconers, lamplighters, and grooms, each with specific territories and routines. Mistakes, especially during ceremonies, could lead to public humiliation. Yet despite the hardship, some servants found a kind of rhythm, even pride, in their duties. A loyal chamberlain might serve the same family for decades, trusted with the keys to the storerooms and the schedule of daily rituals. A nursemaid might be beloved by the children she raised, their comfort when ill, their memory keeper as they grew. Medieval castles may have been ruled by lords, but they breathed because of the servants. It was they who made the fires burn, the feasts happen, the beds warm, the armor polished. They were present in every corridor, behind every door, beneath every banner. Anonymous, but indispensable. Without their hands, there would have been no courtly dances, no candlelit banquets, no knights riding out at dawn, only cold stone, empty halls, and silence. From the fog-laced castles of medieval Europe, we now cross into lands bathed in sunlight and shadow, into the grand courts of the Umayyad, Abbasid, and later Fatimid and Andalusian caliphates. Here, from Damascus to Baghdad, from Cairo to Cordoba, the palaces were not only seats of political might, but also cradles of philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and literature. And behind every illuminated manuscript, every perfumed bath, every silken curtain, there were the servants. Let us step inside the Bay al-Khilafah, the house of the Caliph, in Baghdad during its golden age. The scent of saffron and sandalwood lingers in the air. Gold-threaded curtains shift in the breeze from a carved mashrabiyah screen. A eunuch servant moves gracefully across a tiled floor, lighting a burner of oud before the Caliph's arrival. Behind him, a geometric mosaic glows in the dawn light, its symmetry a mirror of divine order. In the kitchens, a boy no older than 10 grinds cloves and cinnamon in a stone mortar. A pot of lamb and lentils simmers over coals, while another servant pours rosewater into brass pitchers. The cook, an older man, murmurs a prayer as he checks the sweetness of a date dish. These meals will be delivered in tiers of gold and silver trays, each one covered with embroidered silk. Meanwhile, in the library wing, known in some courts as the House of Wisdom, a scribe servant carefully unrolls scrolls beside an ink pot. He arranges translated works from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, cleaned, preserved, and illuminated. A senior librarian nods silently in approval. Their hands never touch the sacred text without cleaning them first. Servants in the Islamic world were often drawn from distant lands: Turks, Berbers, Slavs, Abyssinians, and Persians, trained in everything from language and etiquette to cooking and science. Some were Mamluks, trained military slaves who would one day rise to become rulers themselves. Others were Gilman or Jaria, page boys and maidens who served in the palaces and gardens. In the women's quarters, or haram, female servants worked quietly among concubines and royal wives. One combed perfumed oils into the hair of a noblewoman. Another arranged silken robes across a cedar chest. There was laughter here too, gentle, cautious, often hidden beneath veils and whispers. Servants managed the Caliph's ritual ablutions, laying fresh water in ceramic basins, washing the feet of the ruler with scented soap, then drying them with woven cloth. Others managed royal robes dyed in indigo and madder, folding them along preset lines and sealing them in cedar-lined rooms to protect against insects. In the early evening, as lamps flickered to life, a servant would arrange a tray of tea, dates, and honeyed almonds for the Caliph's night study. In the garden beyond, gardeners, also considered servants, trimmed the hedges of myrtle and jasmine while the stars began to appear overhead. Hierarchy among palace staff was deeply formalized. A hajib, chamberlain, oversaw all inner affairs. Under him were attendants, eunuchs, scribes, bathkeepers, cooks, musicians, and healers. Those with access to the ruler were few, and their loyalty had to be absolute. Yet in this refined world, some servants gained influence and renown. A trusted eunuch might become an advisor. A clever scribe might be asked to draft treaties. A skilled musician might perform at court and be granted favor. Their labor, though hidden, shaped policy, pleasure, and daily rhythm alike. Of course, not all treatment was just. Enslaved children might be separated from families or gifted as tributes between rival courts. Punishment for error, a spilled drink, an overheard secret, could be swift. But there were moments of dignity, too. A servant who served well could be freed, educated, and even placed in positions of trust or guardianship. In the still hours after the final prayer, when the palace was quiet, the servants rested in tucked-away corners of stone and wood. They shared stories in many languages. Some memorized verses of the Quran. Others scribbled poetry by lamplight. Among them were dreamers, philosophers, and men who had seen more of the palace than any vizier. They may have left no monuments, but their fingerprints marked every brass tray, every library shelf, every tiled corridor where scholars and sultans walked. From the domed palaces of Baghdad, we ride out into the vast, open steppe where the wind sings through the grasslands and the horizon never ends. This is the heart of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But here, there are no marble halls, no golden chandeliers. The empire's heart beat inside tents, gurs, felt-covered and circular, and among the people who moved with them, including the loyal, unseen hands of its servants. In the time of Genghis Khan and his successors, the court was mobile. It traveled with the seasons, accompanied by herds, soldiers, and household staff, who were as accustomed to mud as they were to silk. These servants, though living simply, maintained strict routines, cooking, cleaning, managing the Khan's gear, arranging diplomatic tents, and preparing for the sudden arrival of envoys or generals. The day began early. In one corner of the camp, a young servant girl milked mares to make ayarag, fermented horse milk, the Mongols' beloved drink. She strained it into a leather pouch hanging from a tripod, swinging it rhythmically until it turned to froth. Nearby, an older cook tended to a pot of boiled mutton, its scent thick in the crisp morning air. Inside the Khan's chair, a high-ranking eunuch or personal attendant quietly dusted the ceremonial saddle, positioned the war bow, and checked the lacquered boxes holding tribute from distant lands. Jade from China, glassware from Persia, and spices from India. These items were both treasures and symbols of submission. The Khan's dwelling was simple but carefully arranged, and no servant dared misplace a single object. Unlike many empires, status among Mongol servants could shift with remarkable speed. A stable boy who proved himself in war might rise to command. A servant who showed great loyalty might be granted a share of the spoils. And while most of the empire's massive conquests were made on horseback, its backbone, the feeding, the movement, the setup, the messages, was done by foot on the shoulders of countless silent laborers. Some were captives from conquered cities, others were born within Mongol society. Many were trained from youth to handle falcons, tend horses, and prepare weapons with care. In a society that revered precision and mobility, a servant's mistake could cost not only their life, but the success of an entire campaign. There were also scribes and interpreters, often foreign-born servants, who worked under strict supervision. These men kept the empire's laws, translated orders, and helped maintain the yum, or postal relay system, which stretched thousands of miles from China to Eastern Europe. These bureaucratic servants lived on the move, often in harsh climates, recording history even as they labored in obscurity. When the Khan's family was present, servants managed the harem tents, attended to the wives' rituals, and prepared cleansing baths using herbs collected from distant valleys. They also guarded royal children and ensured that none went unattended, a failure that could result in severe punishment. Despite the fearsome reputation of the Mongol army, there was a deep sense of internal order and discipline. A tent servant had to know where to place every item, how to speak only when spoken to, and when to disappear entirely. Meals were consumed in silence. Everything was done with efficiency, minimal ceremony, and maximum respect for hierarchy and honor. At night, as the steppe winds howled, the camp quieted. Servants sat around small fires, boiling tea with butter and salt. They shared news in whispered tones of battles, dreams, omens, and their families. Some prayed, facing east. Others simply closed their eyes and waited for sleep beneath the stars. They might not have built temples or palaces, but without their silent labor, the Mongol Empire would not have reached the Danube nor shaken the walls of Baghdad. Their hands stitched the tents that sheltered emperors. Their legs carried messages that shifted the world. Their loyalty and toil were the unseen armor behind the Khan's legend. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia, we descend into the lush gardens and marble palaces of Mughal India, an empire built on the fusion of Persian elegance, Central Asian authority, and Indian sophistication. This was a world of scented courtyards, carved stone screens, and vast imperial kitchens, where emperors ruled beneath painted ceilings and servants shaped the pace and polish of everyday life. The Mughal court, whether in Agra, Delhi, or Lahore, was a realm of layers, political, spiritual, aesthetic. Yet behind the intricate beauty of the Havelis and forts stood a vast army of men and women whose names history did not keep. From the most trusted personal valet to the torchbearer, from courier boys to spice grinders, each had a task, and each served a world too grand to rest. Before sunrise, a cook stirred to life in the royal kitchens, or bawarchi khana. A servant rinsed rice in copper pots, while another pounded cardamom and cloves into a fragrant paste. Flames danced beneath clay stoves, and ghee hissed as it hit iron pans. Nihari, biryanis, and sweetmeats would be prepared not for a single table, but for hundreds of mouths, emperors, courtiers, musicians, and laborers alike. In the emperor's private quarters, a khidmatgar, personal attendant, carefully unrolled silk garments dyed in hues of pomegranate and saffron. He folded turbans with mathematical precision, checked the clasps of jeweled footwear, and made sure that rose water had been sprinkled over the room's cool marble floor. The servant's expression was still, but his mind alert. A single misstep before the emperor could mean disgrace. Down the halls, female attendants lit incense in the zenana, the women's quarters, where empresses, concubines, and royal daughters lived. One maid massaged sandalwood oil into the scalp of a noblewoman. Another swept fallen petals from the carved stone floor, careful not to disturb the patterns drawn with powdered dyes. In this part of the palace, servants were confidants, messengers, stylists, and watchers, all bound to secrecy. Elsewhere, a palace eunuch inspected the courtyard, where a line of dancers, poets, and petitioners gathered. It was his task to decide who would be allowed into the diwani khaz, the hall of private audience. Behind him stood scribes, record-keepers, and junior aides, each holding ledgers, scrolls, or velvet pouches of coin. These were the quiet bureaucrats of power. And in the gardens, vast, symmetrical, and flowing with fountains, barefoot workers tended to jasmine vines and trimmed cypress trees. They were not merely gardeners. They were keepers of timeless geometry, of paradise itself. The Mughal love of gardens, drawn from Persian ideals of Jannat, heaven, made even the flower bed a sacred space, maintained by invisible, calloused hands. The Mughal court had a strict hierarchy of servants, often detailed in court manuals like the Ain-i-Akbariye. There were Baraz, porters who carried palanquins or ceremonial items, Bakia, Navisis, recorders who wrote down everything the emperor said, Shahinakal, mimics and jesters who served entertainment purposes, Mishalchi, torchbearers during nighttime movement, and Grakshak, bodyguards drawn from trusted families, Farash, floor attendants who laid carpets, cleaned rooms, and changed coverings, and many more, each title denoting a lifetime of duty. But not all service was gilded. In the storerooms and washrooms, laundresses beat silks on stone, stable hands carried hay under the monsoon rain, and kitchen boys were burned by pots too hot to carry. These servants lived in side quarters of the palace or on its edge, close enough to serve, too distant to speak. Yet some rose in rank. A trusted khidmatgar might one day serve the emperor's son. A favored maid might become part of the dowry sent to a princess's new household. And sometimes, when a servant's loyalty ran deep, they were given robes of honor, land grants, or even the rare title of mansabdar, a ranked officer in the emperor's own system. At night, the palace dimmed. Musicians played low ragas on the veena, lamps flickered against lattice windows, and the servants? They kept walking quietly, bringing warm water to the bath, folding sleeping mats, refilling oil in the lamps. Their day was never truly done. Their lives were not chronicled in court histories. But without their presence, the emperor would have sat alone in an unlit hall, in an unwashed robe, with no one to bring him the poetry he loved. From the fragrant palaces of Mughal India, we now pass through wooden gates into the hush of a Japanese noble residence during the height of the Heian, Kamakura, or Edo periods. Here, amid the glow of rice paper lanterns and the hush of falling cherry blossoms, servants moved silently, like shadows cast by candlelight, ever present, yet rarely acknowledged. Unlike the vast empires of the West, feudal Japan was deeply hierarchical and localized. Power resided in daimyo lords and above them the shogun. The emperor remained a divine figure, often distant from the workings of daily life. Within this social framework, servants and attendants upheld centuries-old rituals, every movement defined by restraint and grace. In a daimyo's estate, mornings began with soft steps across polished wood. A maidservant, her kimono plain but clean, quietly slid open a fusuma panel, carrying a tray with green tea and pickled plums. She placed it with practiced care before her mistress, bowing deeply before departing, her sleeves barely brushing the mat. Elsewhere, in the garden courtyard, a gardener servant gently clipped the edge of a pine tree, shaping it into a perfect curve. He worked in silence, aware of every stone, every koi in the pond, every ripple. This was not just gardening. It was devotion to the ideals of wabi-sabi, beauty in imperfection, harmony in simplicity. Within the inner household, a senior servant known as the kosho oversaw the movements of junior attendants. She kept time with the bells, ensured the fires in the hearth were stoked, and monitored the condition of scrolls and silks. The lady-in-waiting, though technically noble, often served like a glorified attendant, combing the noblewoman's hair, applying white powder to her face, arranging poetry books and incense. In the shogun's castle, roles were even more rigid. Samurai retainers, though warriors, also performed formal duties, guarding chambers, delivering messages, organizing feasts. Servants here were part of a code-bound society, where honor and obedience carried equal weight. Among the most revered forms of service was the chado, the tea ceremony. A tea-serving maid might train for years to master the correct way to bow, to whisk matcha without bubbles, to fold the fukusa cloth with reverence. Guests would not see her face fully, only her hands in motion, her voice never raised. Every detail of the room, the hanging scroll, the fresh tatami, the scent of the charcoal, was her responsibility. In the kitchens, cooks prepared rice, miso, grilled fish, and mountain vegetables. A younger servant fanned the coals while an older one stirred dashi broth in an iron pot. Meals were arranged on lacquerware trays, each dish carefully balanced for color and season. These meals were not just nourishment, they were expressions of the moment, respectful of the natural world. Servants also managed clothing, folding kimonos into perfect squares, airing them against cedar, and carefully tucking away seasonal garments in wooden chests. Hairdressers would arrange elaborate styles with pins and combs, while others managed perfumes made from plum, sandalwood, or iris root. Unlike in other empires, many Japanese servants lived close to their masters, often within the same compound or even attached to their person in travel. Their loyalty was assumed to be lifelong. Disobedience or breach of etiquette could mean instant dismissal, or worse, loss of face, a concept more devastating than any punishment. There was little opportunity for mobility. A servant remained a servant. Yet in this culture, the perfection of one's role was seen as a virtue. A servant who poured tea flawlessly, who remembered the favorite incense of a visiting scholar, or who maintained the estate's stones free of moss, such a person was quietly honored. At night, when the sliding panels were drawn shut and only the sound of wind and insects filled the air, servants would gather in the rear rooms. They shared small cups of sake, murmured haiku, or folded paper cranes from discarded scraps. They spoke of their families in far villages, or simply sat in silence, content in duty, watchful until dawn. They were not warriors, poets, or emperors, but without them no robe would have been folded, no tea stirred, no ink ground, for the poems that have echoed through centuries. They were the breath of the household, calm, unnoticed, essential. From the paper screen stillness of Japan, we now cross into the humid, fragrant world of Southeast Asia, deep into the heart of the Khmer Empire. At its height in the 12th century, this kingdom spread across modern-day Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, leaving behind one of the world's greatest architectural wonders, Angkor Wat. But this grandeur was not built by kings alone. Beneath the stone spires, along the sacred canals, and inside the cool halls of the palace, it was the steady labor of countless servants that kept the spiritual and royal life of the Khmer Empire in motion. Each morning began with offerings. As the orange light of dawn filtered through the jungle canopy, a servant lit oil lamps before a carved statue of Vishnu or Shiva. She placed lotus flowers in copper bowls and sprinkled jasmine petals along the temple threshold. Her role was not just practical, it was sacred. Every act was a step in a cosmic ritual, echoing the empire's devotion to balance between the earthly and the divine. In the royal residence, constructed of stone and timber, servants moved barefoot across cool flagstones. One carried woven mats for the nobles to sit on. Another adjusted the folds of the king's robe, stitched from silk and dyed with natural colors. Behind them, young aides prepared fans woven from palm leaves, while cooks in the rear stoked firewood and stirred pots of spiced fish broth and sticky rice. The Khmer Palace was not simply a home, it was an extension of the universe, modeled after the mythic Mount Meru. Servants were taught how to move through its spaces in precise ways, to enter barefoot, to bow at the right angles, to place objects in lines that mirrored cosmic order. These duties were passed down from master to apprentice, in a rhythm as steady as the monsoon rains. Some of the palace attendants were dancers and musicians, trained from childhood to perform in temple ceremonies. Their movements, taught by older servant instructors, were not entertainment, they were offerings to the gods. Servants strung flower garlands, painted faces with mineral pigments, and tuned bamboo flutes for the court's sacred performances. In the palace kitchens, clay stoves glowed. One servant pounded lemongrass, galangal, and turmeric into paste. Others steamed rice wrapped in banana leaves or roasted fish caught from the Tonle Sap Lake. Even the arrangement of food on bronze platters was done with meaning. Roundness symbolizing the cycle of time, balance indicating respect to nature. Further within the compound, water carriers collected fresh rain in ceramic jars, used for drinking, bathing, and ritual cleansing. They walked carefully, aware that spilled water was not just a mess, it was a disruption in harmony. Every servant, no matter their rank, played a part in maintaining the unseen threads of cosmic balance. Unlike in other empires, Khmer servants were often organized into guilds and collectives with distinct training. A group might specialize in cleaning temple grounds, another in textile dyeing, another in chariot preparation. These roles were hereditary, passed down within families, and deeply respected. Not merely manual labor, but a social and spiritual craft. During royal ceremonies, hundreds of servants prepared for hours. Drapes were hung, incense lit, and paths swept with bundles of reeds. A torchbearer stood ready at the entrance. A water attendant adjusted the golden basin for ritual washing. Nearby, a young assistant waited silently, holding a polished mirror before the queen, whose face was being painted by a court artist. But there were also moments of solitude. In quiet hours, a servant sat beneath the shade of a banyan tree, combing knots from a noble child's hair. Another swept dust from the foot of a statue that had watched over the palace for centuries. These small acts, unnoticed by the world, echoed with the same care and reverence as temple chants. When night fell, and the jungle filled with the cries of frogs and cicadas, the palace quieted. Servants laid down their bundles, rolled out mats in side halls, and whispered prayers into the dark. They spoke of the next day's tasks, of their families, of the rain. Some fell asleep beneath murals painted in long-forgotten colors, beside pools that reflected the stars. Their footprints have long faded from the moss-covered stones. But in every worn stair, every temple step, and every carved face, their hands are still visible, not as conquerors, not as kings, but as caretakers of something vast, delicate, and eternal. And so, across the sands of Egypt, the hills of Greece, the marble halls of Rome, and the mist-laced corridors of Asia, we have followed the quiet footsteps of those history rarely names. The servants. They rose before dawn and slept long after the halls had emptied. Their hands scrubbed floors, poured wine, composed scrolls, and stirred soups whose recipes have long vanished. They bent to ritual, to command, and to silence. And in doing so, they carried empires on their backs. They lived without monument, yet without them no crown would shine, no court would sing, no ruler could rule. Tonight as you rest, let their stories echo softly. let them settle like dust on ancient stone. For though history remembers the kings, it was these hidden souls who lit the lamps, opened the gates, and kept the world quietly turning. Let us turn not to kings or warriors, but to those who walked quietly through history, men who left the cities, the markets, the warm arms of family, and chose instead a life behind stone walls, under cloaks of silence. These were monks, not the mythical beings of peace we often imagine, but real breathing men, flesh and spirit in constant conflict. To many, their lives seemed pure, lives of prayer, discipline, and solitude. But behind monastery gates and cave entrances, beneath robes of humility, there burned hunger, confusion, doubt, and desire. Some came to escape the world. Others sought to defeat the self. Some found holiness. Others found torment. Tonight, we follow them. Not to judge, but to understand. Let us begin where monastic life first took shape, in the heat, silence, and fierce solitude of the Egyptian desert. Before we begin, support my work by liking the video and subscribing if you enjoy it. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time you usually go to sleep. It always makes me smile to see people from all over the world tuning in. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and relax. You're just about to drift off with a story. The sun rises without sound over the Skeets Desert. Its golden light pours across cracked earth and limestone cliffs, revealing nothing but sand, rock, and stillness. But within this silence, a figure stirs, cloaked in rough wool, skin darkened by sun and fasts, eyes deep as wells. He is a monk, a hermit, a man who has not spoken aloud in weeks. His name is Anthony. Not a saint, yet just a man who once sold his inheritance and walked into the desert to find God. His shelter is little more than a cave carved into stone. A low fire still smolders near the entrance, tended before the stars faded. Around him lie a few clay pots, a dried piece of bread, and a bundle of worn scripture copied by hand. His day begins not with food, but with stillness. He kneels. He breathes. Hours pass. There is no bell, no clock. Time is measured only by shadow. The Desert Fathers believed that silence could tame the beast within. But silence also has a way of unearthing what words keep buried. In the stillness, strange visions come. Some see angels. Others are not so lucky. Anthony once saw a golden woman in a dream. Her skin flawless, her voice like honey, she offered him shade and comfort. He awoke shaking, covered in sweat, and struck his own chest with a stone until the image faded. Such stories are not rare. Many monks here speak of temptations with teeth, not from outside, but within. In the heat of midday, Anthony does not rest. He weaves baskets from palm fronds, his fingers blistered and red. He will sell them later, through a trader who visits once a week. It is not profit he seeks, but humility through labor. Sometimes he walks, barefoot, across the burning sand, repeating the name of God with each step, hoping repetition will drown the roar of thoughts. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it does not. He eats, once a day, a crust of bread, maybe an olive. The hunger, he says, sharpens the spirit. And as dusk falls and the jackals cry in the hills, he returns to his cave, where the silence waits for him like an old companion. Sleep is not an escape. In dreams, the voices are louder, but Anthony remains. Not because he is without desire, but because he is learning to live with it. The winds of the Syrian steppe carry fine dust and strange silence. It is the 5th century, and the Eastern Roman world is changing. Emperors come and go. The cities bustle with merchants and mosaics. But far from Antioch and Constantinople, in the dry hills near Qalat Simon, a different kind of man lives a different kind of life. His name is Simeon, though most now call him Simeon the Stylite. He does not walk the earth like other men. He stands day and night atop a pillar nearly 50 feet high, a narrow platform of stone barely wide enough to lie down. Why? Because even the solitude of a cave, even the silence of a monastery, was not enough for Simeon. He believed the body was an obstacle, a distraction, a thing to tame, break, forget. His followers, and there were many, say he once stood atop his pillar for 37 years, exposed to the rain, the cold, the wind, and the burning Syrian sun. He did not descend. Food was brought up by a rope. Waste was lowered in a basket. His legs atrophied, his feet cracked open and bled. But he would not come down. Below, crowds gathered, peasants, soldiers, women with children, bishops, even nobles on horseback. They sought his prayers, his words, a blessing, a judgment, a miracle. And Simeon would lean over the edge, thin, weathered, bearded like a prophet, and speak in soft, slow tones, sometimes only in whispers. His words were said to carry healing. Others said his voice sounded like it came from beyond this world. But his day, like other monks, began with prayer. Though prayer atop a pillar is different, he bowed in place, again and again, sometimes hundreds of times, before the sun reached its peak. Each movement sent sharp pain through his knees and spine, but he welcomed it. Pain was a language between him and God. His meals were minimal: boiled lentils, a piece of dried fig, a sip of rainwater caught in a bowl. Flies came, so did birds, so did fever. Once, a monk from a distant monastery climbed the pillar to tend to Simeon's wounds. He found his back riddled with sores, and his ribs visible through torn skin. "Come down, Father," he begged. But Simeon only shook his head. "If I descend, I may desire to stay below." Not all monks lived on pillars. Some withdrew into caves, the dry stone pockets that pocked the hills of Syria. These were known as anchorites, Christians who sought total withdrawal from the world. They carved crosses into the rock, slept on cold ground, and recited scripture by flickering lamplight. Some never saw another face for years. Others spoke only once a week. Many wrestled with temptation, not of the flesh, but of the mind. Loneliness was not peace, it was a test. A voice in the dark cave would whisper, "You are forgotten." Another would say, "You are holy. Let them worship you." Pride, doubt, madness, holiness, they swirled together like smoke in the cave air. One hermit, it is said, went blind from years of staring at the sun during prayer. Another lost his voice from fasting and chanting until his throat cracked. Some wrote prayers in the sand and watched the wind carry them away, saying, "Let God read them." These Syrian monks were not trying to escape the world, they were trying to transcend it. And in doing so, they created a strange spectacle. People began building churches around their caves. Monks became saints, martyrs in life, not death. Yet not all who climbed the pillar or entered the cave emerged with peace. Some broke. Some screamed in the night. Some came down quietly, their faces blank, their faith dissolved. The path to heaven, they learned, passed directly through the deepest parts of the self. The jungle breathes with slow heat, thick with the scent of wet bark, moss, and flowering vines. In the early dawn, before the sun melts the dew, a single figure walks barefoot along a dirt path, worn smooth by centuries of quiet footsteps. His robe is simple, saffron-dyed cotton draped loosely across one shoulder. His head is shaved, his gaze lowered. He carries nothing but a wooden bowl and a cloth bag. He is a bhikkhu, a Buddhist monk, and the forest is both his monastery and his teacher. This is ancient India, perhaps during the reign of Emperor Ashoka, when Buddhism flourished not only in cities and temples but in remote corners of the land. Monks like him followed the Buddha's path not in grand halls but among banyan trees, river banks, and forest clearings. They lived not in isolation from nature, but woven into it. Each morning begins in silence. He rises before the birds begin their songs. There are no beds, only a mat of leaves. He stands, palms together, eyes closed. His breath is the first chant. His body, stiff from the damp cold, is not stretched or pampered, only stilled. He walks mindfully, one step per breath, into a nearby village. This is the alms round, a central part of monastic life. He does not beg with words. He only stands, bowl extended, gaze lowered. Some villagers place rice, lentils, or a fruit into his bowl with reverence. Others glance at him with indifference. He accepts both with equal grace. The food is consumed before noon. Monks are forbidden to eat after midday, a rule meant not only for discipline but to prevent attachment to indulgence. He eats slowly, chewing each bite with awareness. There is no seasoning, no luxury, just sustenance. Back in the forest, he returns to his vihara, a small stone hut or a shaded area beneath a tree. The afternoon is spent in meditation, seated cross-legged, spine upright, hands resting lightly in his lap. His breath becomes his anchor. Thoughts rise like waves, desires, regrets, memories of a former life when he was a merchant's son or a soldier. He watches them without clinging, but detachment is not always easy. Desire, the Buddha said, is the root of suffering, and monks too feel its pull. There are stories of monks who fell in love with the women who fed them, of visions during meditation, a woman's face, a scent remembered, a voice in a dream. Some wept in shame, others returned their robes and walked back to worldly life. But not all. Many stayed, not because they felt no desire, but because they learned to observe it, like smoke curling through the air. They learned not to deny their humanity, but to see it clearly and choose not to follow it. Evening brings chanting, low, melodic recitations of the Dhammapada or the sutras. The forest echoes with sound, like a breath drawn from the earth itself. At night, the forest becomes a place of challenge. The sounds of wild animals grow louder. Insects crawl beneath mats. Fear arises, of illness, of death, of failure. But the monk returns to the breath, always the breath. Sometimes he dreams of the world he left behind, of a wife he never married, of a life unlived. He wakes with tears, then sits and begins again. To be a forest monk is not to run away from life, but to face it without armor. And in doing so, some found peace. The Atlantic wind howls like a beast across jagged cliffs and cold gray waves. Far off the western coast of Ireland, a cluster of rocks rises out of the sea like broken teeth. On one of those inlets, Skellig Michael, a handful of men have built something astonishing. Stone beehive huts, perched at the edge of the world. No fireplaces, no comforts, just rough domes of stone, stacked without mortar. Here live the monks of early medieval Ireland. The 7th century has arrived. Europe is fracturing under the weight of chaos. Roman order has faded. Kingdoms rise and fall. But in these remote islands and green hills, monks pursue something beyond politics and conquest. They seek union with God through hardship, silence, and cold. Their lives are ruled by the rhythm of the sea and the breath of the wind. Days begin before light, often in rain or mist. A bell chime, soft but firm, signals the first call to prayer. Inside their stone cells, the air is damp. Walls drip with condensation. Their robes, made of coarse wool, are rarely dry. The first prayer of the day is recited in Latin. Psalms, chants, sometimes spoken softly, other times sung in unison. Their voices carry across the cliffs, swallowed quickly by the wind. Breakfast is a small portion of soaked oats or stale bread. If the sea was kind, there may be fish, dried and salted. Otherwise, they subsist on what they grow in terraced gardens, carved out of the rock, leeks, onions, maybe some bitter greens. Every action is intentional, no time is wasted. Some tend to the gardens, others maintain the stonework, fighting against the pull of gravity and weather. A few copy manuscripts, hunched inside a cramped stone oratory, scraping ink from oak galls and writing on stretched animal skin. The Irish monks became famed for their script. Elegant, flowing, laced with intricate decoration and interwoven beasts. But even in these sacred tasks, temptations arise. Many monks here were not born to isolation. They had known families, women, music, drink. Memories don't vanish in salt air. One brother, named Yogan, was said to mutter poetry under his breath as he tilled the earth, love poems, fragments from his youth, about a girl with black hair and skin like warm milk. He was warned, gently, to let go. But at night, he still looked westward, toward the distant mainland. Temptation wasn't always of the flesh. Sometimes it was pride, monks competing over who fasted longer, who copied more pages, who kept stricter silence. Humility, they knew, was the highest virtue. But even that could be a mask for spiritual vanity. The elements were punishing. Storms could trap them for days. Food would rot, fires would fail, walls would leak. Illness spread quickly. There was no physician but prayer. Death, when it came, was buried in shallow graves, the bodies wrapped in wool, faces turned east. But the monks endured, not because they found joy in suffering, but because they believed their lives were a living offering. Every ache, every shiver, every lost comfort was a thread woven into something larger than themselves. And in the cold silence of the night, as waves crashed below and stars pierced the sky like ancient eyes, they whispered their final prayers, not for salvation, but for stillness. For in that stillness, they believed, God might speak. The wind is thin up here, cold and dry like breath from another world. The Himalayas rise like frozen gods above the clouds, their jagged peaks veiled in mist and silence. Nestled among the slopes, far beyond the reach of trade routes and kings, lies a monastery, painted in red, white, and gold, pressed against the stone like a secret held by the mountain itself. This is Tibet sometime in the 13th century. The empire has fractured. Nomadic tribes pass in the valleys below, but in these high halls of silence, monks gather like flickering lamps in a sea of snow. Inside, the monastery is quiet but never still. Prayer wheels spin slowly, incense curls through the rafters. Butter lamps flicker, casting golden shadows on the faces of monks wrapped in deep maroon robes, their heads freshly shaved, their feet calloused from walking in the cold. The day begins long before sunrise. Gong sounds through the mountain air, low and trembling like the voice of the earth. The monks rise silently from woolen mats. Their rooms are bare. A mat, a bowl, a robe, perhaps a prayer scroll tucked under stone. They do not speak. Speech is reserved, not forbidden, but carefully used. In the great hall, they sit in long rows on cushions. Their voices rise in unison, deep, resonant chanting, Sanskrit syllables layered over Tibetan melody. The sound is hypnotic, vibrating through wood and bone. After prayer, they eat together. Barley porridge with butter tea, salty, warm, and thick. Some struggle with the taste at first, but the tea is a lifeline in the cold. Then come the lessons. Not just scripture, but logic, debate, philosophy. The young monks, novices, are trained to argue with grace and precision. In the courtyard, two monks face each other. One claps loudly, posing a question. The other must answer, instantly, clearly. These debates are not hostile. They are sacred, a dance of intellect sharpening the blade of the mind. But beneath the discipline lies the weight of expectation. Some monks entered the monastery by choice. Others were brought as boys, their fate decided by dreams or omens or family tradition. A few were recognized as tulkus reincarnated, teachers, and raised under enormous pressure to live up to their past lives. There are stories of monks who could not endure it, who fled in the night, leaving their robes behind, or those who stayed, but whose minds unraveled slowly under the pressure of spiritual perfection. Temptation, too, was not absent in the mountains. Despite vows of celibacy, longing sometimes flickered in the heart. One monk, it is said, fell in love with a village woman who brought offerings to the gate each spring. He never spoke to her, never touched her, but he waited each year, heart pounding, just to see her face. He confessed this not with shame, but with pain. A pain his master met with quiet understanding. The inner life of a Tibetan monk was filled with paradox. They were trained to extinguish ego, yet some were revered like living gods. They were taught to detach, yet they often wept when fellow monks died. They chanted about the illusion of the world, yet still marveled at the color of a flower in spring. In the upper chambers of the monastery, special rituals unfolded. There were tantric practices, secret teachings passed only to those prepared. Not erotic, as outsiders sometimes misbelieve, but symbolic. They used imagery of union and transformation to dissolve the self. Monks would meditate for days on a single syllable, Om, Om, until their sense of separation collapsed. Some entered caves for retreats, weeks, months, even years in isolation. One monk lived in a dark cave for 3 full winters, surviving on barley flour and melted snow. He emerged thin as a reed, his face shining with peace. And then there were the oracles, chosen monks who through ritual dance and trance allowed the divine to speak through them. Clad in ceremonial robes, they would spin and chant until their voices changed. Their movements became unnatural. It was not performance, it was sacred danger. The mind could fracture. But still they returned. For Tibetan monks did not seek escape. They sought to know every corner of the mind, even the dark ones. And in doing so, they became mirrors for us all, reflections of our own struggle between peace and chaos, devotion and doubt. The mist rolls low across the forest floor, curling through bamboo groves and mossy stones. A temple bell rings once, clear and deep, its sound fading into the quiet morning like a thought dissolving into stillness. This is Japan during the Kamakura period, a time of samurai clans, shifting power, and spiritual hunger. Amid the political tension, something quieter takes root: Zen. Here in a modest temple on the slope of Mount Hiei, a Zen monk opens his eyes. He did not wake to the bell. He was already sitting, still, in zazen posture. His knees ache, his spine burns, but he remains calm. In Zen, discomfort is not the enemy, it is the teacher. He wears a simple robe, clean but worn, tied with a dark sash. His head is shaved, not only as a symbol of renunciation, but to remove vanity. He owns almost nothing: a bowl, a robe, a straw mat, a set of prayer beads, and a journal filled with calligraphy that no one else may ever read. His life is rhythm. The day begins in silence. He steps from the meditation hall and walks to the kitchen garden with slow, deliberate strides. Every movement, opening the door, washing the hands, picking a radish, is a form of meditation. Zen does not separate the sacred and the mundane. Breakfast is prepared together by the tenzo, the temple cook, often a senior monk. A simple soup of rice, miso, and perhaps a few greens, offered in silence and received with reverence. Before eating, a chant is spoken. We reflect on the effort that brought us this food. We reflect on our virtue and conduct. We regard it as medicine to sustain our life. We accept it so we may attain enlightenment. It is not a ritual to appease a god. It is to sharpen awareness, to remember that life is fleeting and attention is everything. After breakfast comes more zazen, sitting meditation, sometimes for hours. The monk folds his legs, back straight, hands resting gently in his lap, eyes half open. He watches his breath, he watches his thoughts, he lets go of both. If his mind wanders, a soft tap from the kyosaku, the encouragement stick, gently strikes his shoulder, not as punishment but as reminder. Later, they tend to the grounds, raking gravel into perfect lines, clipping bonsai, scrubbing temple floors. Every task is done without haste or pride. To a Zen monk, polishing a tile can be as profound as reading scripture. But Zen is not always serene. It is filled with paradox. A monk may meditate for 10 years and find nothing. Then, one day, as a cup breaks or a leaf falls, they are struck by sudden awakening. Satori, a moment when all thoughts vanish and reality is seen as it truly is. These moments are rare, but they are not always gentle. One monk, after 10 years of silence and discipline, was once scolded harshly by his master. "You have learned nothing." The student wept, humiliated, but in that collapse something shifted, his pride shattered. And into that emptiness, clarity rushed in. Not all monks reached this place. Some struggled with doubt. They questioned the silence, the endless sitting, the lack of answers. One confessed secretly to a visiting priest, "I have forgotten what I came here to find." The Taishan, too, lived in the temple shadows. Not loud or carnal, but subtle. A longing for recognition, a jealousy of others' insight, a memory of touch, a desire for comfort. Zen demanded the full abandonment of ego, and yet ego always lingered, just behind the breath. In the evenings, the monks returned to their cushions. The bell rang again. Outside, the cicadas buzzed in the pines. The garden was still, and in that stillness one might find enlightenment, or just another night of aching knees and wandering thoughts. Both were sacred. The bell rings across the cloister just before sunrise, its echo weaving through the mist-covered fields and stone corridors. Within the walls of a medieval Benedictine monastery, the day begins not with conversation, but with rhythm. The rhythm of prayer, silence, and obedience. This is 11th century Europe. Feudal lords bicker over land. Armies clash under banners of kings and popes. Outside these walls there is ambition and blood. But here, within the thick, damp stone of the abbey, life follows a different rule. The rule of Saint Benedict. Composed centuries earlier, the rule is more than a list of instructions. It is a way of life, etched into every corner of the monastic day. It promises balance: work, worship, study, silence. But balance does not mean ease, and peace does not mean freedom from struggle. A Benedictine monk rises before dawn, answering the call of the matins bell. He moves in darkness, feet bare against the cold stone. No words are spoken. The chapel is dimly lit by wax tapers. There, with dozens of others, he chants psalms in Latin, not for performance, but as a discipline of breath, mind, and soul. This is only the first of 8 prayer services he will attend today. After matins and lauds, they break fast: a piece of rye bread, some beans, water or watered wine. Meals are eaten in silence, while a reader, assigned by the abbot, recites scripture aloud from a pulpit. Even food is not a moment for indulgence. The tongue is not to be trusted. Then comes labor. The monks work in fields, gardens, kitchens, or scriptoriums. One copies the Gospels onto calfskin with painstaking care, eyes strained under flickering oil lamps. Another brews ale in a chilled stone cellar, measuring yeast and water with exacting attention. A third tills a vegetable patch, hands red with soil. Manual labor is not punishment here. It is prayer made physical. The Benedictines believe that idleness invites temptation. The hands must move. The body must serve. Only then can the mind resist what it so often craves. But temptation does not knock with open noise. It creeps in like damp through stone. There are whispered stories of brothers who grew attached to their own voices during chant, who began singing louder to be noticed. Of those who spent too long alone in the cellar, where wine casks whispered comfort in dark corners. And of course, the most dangerous desire. There was Brother Armand, whose gaze lingered too long on a local widow who came weekly with bread for the poor. She was quiet, kind, and carried sadness in her eyes. He confessed, not the act, but the longing, The abbot heard him with gentleness, then assigned him extra days of silence, copying penitential texts in the coldest room of the abbey. Some monks broke entirely. They abandoned their robes and disappeared into the world, some to become scholars, some to marry, others to disappear into wine and anonymity. But most stayed, not because they were without desire, but because they believed in the daily fight against it, that holiness was not perfection, but persistence. The monastery is a place of order, hora et labora, pray and work, but even within order, there are moments of quiet rebellion. At night, when the final bell of Compline rings, the monks return to their cells, narrow rooms, a straw mattress, a cross above the door. The silence is heavy, but inside, thoughts churn. One wonders if he is truly closer to God than the blacksmith in the village. Another remembers a laugh from his childhood and weeps quietly, unsure why. A third feels nothing, just emptiness, and prays for feeling to return. The next day will be the same, and the day after that. But in the smallness of repetition, the monks believe something sacred is taking shape, something beyond understanding. In that slow, patient discipline, God might be found. Far out in the northern Aegean Sea, the waters turn dark and deep beneath a jagged, pine-covered mountain that seems to rise straight from the ocean. This is Mount Athos, the holy mountain, a narrow peninsula that for more than 1,000 years has stood apart from the world, not in geography alone, but in spirit. By imperial decree, no woman has ever set foot here. Not even female animals are allowed, save for cats to chase the mice. It is a world of men, of silence, and of the ceaseless pursuit of divine stillness. The monks of Mount Athos live in a collection of ancient monasteries, scattered across cliffs and forests like pearls on a prayer rope. By the 10th century, these communities had become a beacon of Eastern Orthodox asceticism, part sanctuary, part battlefield of the soul. A monk rises long before the sun breaks the horizon. There are no alarm bells, only the soft rhythm of inner habit. He washes his face in cold water from a stone basin. There is no luxury, no mirror, no thought of appearance. His robe, black, thick, and wrapped tight against the chill, is worn not for fashion, but for death. Black symbolizes mourning, for the world, for the ego, for sin. He does not speak. Not yet. He walks barefoot across stone corridors to the Catholicon, the main chapel of the monastery. Inside, a single oil lamp flickers beneath a painted icon of Christ's Pantocrator. The scent of incense, frankincense, aged and sharp, fills the dark air. The vigil begins. Orthodox monks often pray through the night. Services last for hours, psalms, canticles, the hymns of ancient saints. They stand, they bow, they cross themselves again and again. Their chanting is deep, slow, and hypnotic, a wave of human breath stretching across centuries. They chant in Greek or Slavonic, depending on the monastery. There is no rush, no applause. The goal is not emotional fervor, but stillness. Stillness deep enough for the heart to open and listen. After prayer, the monks eat together in the trapeza, the refectory. Stone walls, long wooden tables. Meals are silent. A reader recites the lives of saints or sayings of the desert fathers, while they eat lentils, black bread, olives, perhaps a few vegetables from the garden. No meat. Never meat. Meals are not for pleasure. They are for nourishment and humility. A monk who eats too quickly may be gently corrected. Eat with prayer, they are reminded. Afterward, the monks return to their tasks. Some work in the vineyards or olive groves. Others tend to goats, gather honey, repair ancient books. One may spend hours carving a wooden cross, sanding it slowly, not for sale, but as an offering. Labor, like prayer, is sacred here. But the work is only half the life. The other half happens in silence, deep, sometimes painful, silence. Temptation doesn't roar on Mount Athos, it whispers. Some monks battle thoughts of lust. Others feel the pull of pride, especially those who gain reputations for wisdom or visions. A few struggle with despair. A spiritual illness the monks call acedia, the sense that nothing matters, that even holiness is meaningless. They fight these shadows with the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Repeated endlessly, sometimes out loud, sometimes whispered, sometimes simply breathed. The prayer becomes a heartbeat, a shield, a mirror. There are hermits, too, monks who leave the monastery entirely and live in stone huts or caves deeper in the hills. They see no one for days, even weeks. Some speak to animals, others speak only to God. One was said to have lived for 30 years with only a single icon, a candle, and a jug of rainwater. And yet, temptation found them too. A story tells of a hermit who wept for 3 days after dreaming of a feast, not because of gluttony, but because in his dream he had laughed. He feared joy itself was a trap, but not all was sorrow. There were moments of light, visions of the Virgin Mary, voices in the silence, a sudden warmth in the chest during prayer that monks swore was not imagination. They called it the uncreated light, a direct experience of God's presence. It was rare, but they lived for it. Night falls slowly on Mount Athos, the sea turns silver, the mountains darken. One by one the oil lamps are lit, the monks return to the chapel for Compline, the final prayer of the day. The black robes gather, the chants begin again, and in that long, deep, wordless night, they do not seek comfort. They seek eternity. In the shifting sands of the Islamic world, from the alleys of Baghdad to the narrow lanes of Konya, from the rose gardens of Shiraz to the windswept caravanserais of Central Asia, there walks a different kind of monk, a seeker. He wears no robe of office. His cloak may be patched, his sandals worn, he owns little, but within him burns a fire, soft and endless. He is a Sufi, not a monk in the formal Christian sense, but an ascetic, a mystic, a lover of God. And like the monks of other faiths, his life is shaped by prayer, struggle, and longing. It is dawn in 13th century Konya, and the city is still. The call to prayer echoes from the minarets, rolling over the domes like a wave of light. Inside a modest zawiya, a Sufi lodge, the dervishes rise. They do not rise hurriedly, they do not speak. Each man wraps a cloth around his waist, rinses his hands and face, and moves to the prayer rug. They pray like other Muslims, 5 times a day facing Mecca, but they also engage in deeper practices. Dhikr, the remembrance of God, repeated until the heart itself beats the name Allah. Their teacher, or peer, leads them in silence. His beard is long, his eyes gentle but piercing. He once lived in the world, perhaps as a scholar or merchant, but left it all to seek the divine. The day begins with sama, spiritual listening. One dervish plays a reed flute. Another taps a hand drum. A third recites Rumi, I have seen the king with a face of glory. He who is not in love is no one. Some sway as they listen, others weep. For Sufis, poetry is not a luxury, it is scripture for the heart. They work too, some in gardens, others as scribes or weavers. Sufis are not separated from the world like monks in stone cloisters. They walk through bazaars, eat with farmers, sit in silence beside the poor. But within their hearts, they carry a monastic solitude. Many are celibate, others marry, but even in marriage, they see the face of the beloved, not just their spouse, but God behind the veil. Desire is not denied in Sufism, it is transformed. But it is still a struggle. One dervish, a young man named Yusuf, speaks privately to his peer. He confesses that in prayer he sometimes imagines a woman he once loved. He has fasted, He has chanted. Still, the memory returns. His peer does not scold him. He places a hand on Yusuf's chest and says, "Desire is not your enemy, it is a horse. If you master it, it will carry you to the beloved. If you let it lead, it will trample you." And so Yusuf prays again, not to erase love, but to use it. At night, the dervishes gather for the whirling. They wear white robes and tall felt hats. They bow, the flute begins. Slowly they turn, one foot rooted, the other spinning around it. Right hand raised to the sky, left hand turned down to the earth. They are the bridge between divine and human. They turn and turn and turn. Eyes closed, minds still, hearts full. This is not performance, this is surrender. But not all Sufis whirl. Some walk the deserts in silence, praying as they walk. Others lock themselves in rooms for 40 days, chilla, surviving on bread and water, chanting the name of God, until the walls themselves seem to breathe it. Some are ridiculed, others are feared. Orthodox scholars accuse them of heresy, of claiming unity with God, of losing the boundary between man and the divine. And some Sufis are executed, not for crimes, but for their words. One Mansur al-Haluk shouted in ecstasy, "Ana al-Haq, I am the truth." For this he was crucified. But his followers did not weep for his death. They whispered that he had become the wine and the cup, the flame and the moth. To be a Sufi was not to escape suffering. It was to taste it fully, deeply, until it melted into love. And so, each night, in cities and caves, in gardens and dust, they chanted, "Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshipper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair." Now we return to Europe in a time of religious upheaval, to the final days of the monk as a pillar of Christendom, when Luther's hammer shook the monasteries of Europe to their foundations. The year is 1517. The monastery walls are still tall, the bells still ring, the candles still flicker beside stone altars. But something has changed. A storm has entered Christendom, not from without, but from within. It began with parchment. A monk in Wittenberg, Martin Luther, nailed a list of 95 theses to a church door. Words challenging indulgences, papal excess, and the very foundation of authority within the Roman Church. The tremor reached every monastery in Europe. Suddenly, the silence of the cloister was pierced, not by swords, but by questions. What is salvation? What is truth? What is the purpose of a life spent behind these walls? Inside a quiet monastery in southern Germany, Brother Matthias walks slowly through the cloister garden. The vines are dying back for winter. Frost glitters on the edges of the stone. His robe brushes the gravel path as he walks in thought. He has heard the rumors. He has read Luther's words, copied secretly by a young novice and hidden in the scriptorium. He has felt the fire of conviction and the chill of doubt. He has lived in the monastery for 21 years, chanted the hours, served the Eucharist, confessed, fasted, prayed. And yet, he begins to wonder, has he lived a lie? Others around him are less torn. Brother Nikolaus, the cellarer, burns a copy of the Theses in a brazier behind the refectory. He calls Luther a heretic, a destroyer of unity. Yet that same evening he is found weeping during Compline, his tears falling silently into his psalter. Some monks leave, not many, but some. They remove their robes. Some return to towns as teachers. Others marry women they once confessed. A few denounce the monastery system entirely, calling it unnatural, a barrier between man and God. The church responds with fear and fury. Monasteries are pressured to defend their purpose. Reforms are demanded. Priors tighten rules, increase fasting, suppress even the faintest hint of sympathy toward the protesters. But something has broken, not just the unity of the church, the image of the monk himself. Once he was seen as a living saint. Now he is mocked in pamphlets, drawn as a glutton, a coward, a man hiding from life. The monks feel it. in the eyes of travelers, in the silence of empty pews, in the withdrawal of donations once offered freely. But still, many remain. They wake each morning and pray the same prayers. They chant the same psalms. They cook the same broth, mend the same robes, plant the same rows of herbs. Not out of blind obedience, but out of love. Brother Matau does not leave. He writes his own confession in ink. One night, I do not know if these walls are a prison or a ladder, but I have heard God here, in the silence in the stone, in my own shame. If this is delusion, then it is the gentlest one I have ever known. The monastery endures, some do not. Across Europe, abbeys are abandoned, their libraries raided, their altars stripped bare. Others are converted into schools, homes, prisons. But the monastic spirit lingers, even amid doubt, even when all certainties seem to collapse. Because for some, the struggle itself is the calling, the conclusion. And so we return, from deserts and forests, from snow-capped peaks and candlelit chapels, from dancing dervishes and silent scribes, to the heart of it all. The man alone, in prayer, in conflict, in search. The monk is not a perfect being. He is not above desire. He does not float through life in peace. He fights every day with his hunger, his pride, his longing, his memory, and his fear. Some fell in love. Some went mad. Some were worshipped. Some were forgotten. But all of them, in their silence, in their solitude, carved a path for the soul. A narrow path, a sacred path, a human path. And as we close our eyes tonight, let us remember, behind the walls of monasteries, beneath robes and rituals, there beat hearts just like ours, reaching, hoping, breaking and healing in the quiet company of God. And so we come to the quiet end of this long and winding path, a path that led us through burning deserts, snow-bound mountains, chanting temples and cloistered stone corridors. We have seen the monk in many forms, bowed in prayer, hunched over parchment, dancing in ecstatic love, or sitting still for hours as the world moved on without him. We saw him tremble with desire, starve with intention, doubt in silence, and rise again each day, not as a figure of perfection, but as a human being wrestling with something eternal. What we learn tonight is not just about monasteries or robes or rituals. It is about the human spirit, our craving for stillness in a noisy world, our search for meaning in the face of suffering, our longing to belong to something greater than ourselves. Every monk we met carried that same fire. Whether he lived on a Syrian pillar, in a forest hut, a Tibetan cave, or a quiet Irish isle. And though their paths were lonely, their purpose was not, because they lived fully, quietly, honestly, in pursuit of something sacred. So as you drift now into the stillness of your own night, remember that the greatest battles are not always fought with swords, but with silence. And that even in solitude, you are never truly alone. For somewhere, in the echo of a chant, in the turn of a prayer bead, in the still breath of the dark, the monks are still keeping watch. Thank you for spending this quiet moment in history with us. If this story brought you peace, perspective, or simply helped you rest a little easier tonight, we invite you to subscribe and join us again tomorrow. There are many more forgotten corners of the past to explore, softly, slowly, one breath at a time. Until then, sleep well, and good night.